Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Cindy Lauper with Change of Heart. On this week's show, I'm going to talk about a paper that I recently read that deals with one of my favorite topics because I think that it's something that is really interesting but also kind of problematic, and it poses some real questions that we need to think about scientifically and think about sensibly and have debates over, because it's not really something that has clear-cut answers or where one opinion is really obviously better than another. And in fact, there are clear areas where there are going to be lots of people with different opinions and they're all equally valid. So it's quite a challenge, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's such an appealing thing to think about. And this is kind of the general topic of what role do humans have and have they had over time in the natural environment. So what defines nature and what is undisturbed, what is pristine, what have humans done over time, and what should we continue to do in the future in terms of interacting with the natural world, and can we interact with it in ways where we can still consider something to be wilderness or natural. And I think probably already some of you guys are feeling that you have thoughts on this and feelings on this, and you already have opinions. But if you think about some of the different viewpoints that are often offered on this topic, you can start to see where other people have some really valid concerns as well. And this is something where I always kind of took things for granted. And then I read a paper that was all about how the Native Americans in California had evolved with that ecosystem for hundreds and hundreds of years, actually probably even thousands of years. And as a result of that, they had caused the adaptation of certain organisms and the evolution of those organisms. And in fact, not only did they kind of co-evolve with these species, they were actually creating the structure of the environment and facilitating the well-being and the longevity of those animals and plants. And in fact, they were opening up the environment so it would actually be more biodiverse than it would have been had the humans not been there. And when I really started thinking about that, it completely changed how I thought about what should we do and what have we done, and where do we kind of look when we're thinking about doing conservation. It's quite easy for us to say, well, we want something to be more natural than it is now. You know, we might see a car park and a building and say that shouldn't be there, that should be trees, it should be more natural. But if you take down those structures and roll back to something in the past, how far back do you go? Do you go back to the way it was just before those things were built? Do you go back hundreds and hundreds of years? Do you go back thousands of years? You know, do we want it to be like primeval forest? What about back when it was glaciated? I mean, it's really quite hard to actually pinpoint what we mean when we say, oh, that should be more natural, or it should be more like it is in the past. And so this paper that I read is about disturbance regimes and thinking about humans as one type of disturbance regime out in nature, and how disturbance regimes can create and also maintain biodiversity. And so if certain types of human disturbances, and maybe not all of them, but certainly a category of them, if they can do these sorts of things, should we actually allow them more than we do today, especially in places that we are setting aside to do conservation and preservation work in? So should we actually allow more human activity in those areas than we currently think that we should? Now, one of the reasons that the authors were interested in approaching this topic is that we often don't kind of think about what has been the historical role of disturbance in certain habitats. So for example, modern Californians, to kind of carry on with what I was talking about before, they often don't look around and think, well, this would have looked very different hundreds of years ago when the original inhabitants of the country were living here and harvesting acorns and pruning the trees and planting seeds to facilitate the future of certain crops, and so on and so on. They just kind of think, well, we humans are here now, we want it to look like it did back when humans weren't here and it was all natural. And they kind of forget that actually there are some historical kind of low-level relevant relative to kind of the stuff we're doing today with, you know, airplanes and cement and all that kind of large-scale climatic and habitat disturbance. They kind of forget that there was that lower-level stuff that happened actually over hundreds and thousands of years and was sustainable and maybe had some benefits. And so we need to look back on what some of those things were and think about the impacts of them and think how they might have shaped the habitat, so that we can then think, well, if we take those away, if we outlaw those behaviors, what will be the implications? And in California, of course, it's a bit too late for that, because those things were outlawed years and years ago. And actually, as a result of that, we see that there are lots of habitats that look completely different. Even in places that are still quite natural, they look like a different sort of natural. They have a different landscape, they have different species, they have different processes and functions that occur, and so it's a very different type of nature than it was when there were humans that were more closely linked with that nature. However, that's just one place where that has already happened. There are still actually lots of places in the world where we do have people that are still living there, doing these sorts of kind of traditional activities, and even though many of those are starting to fade a bit, there are still lots of opportunities where we can go out, find out what they're doing, find out what they have done, think about what impacts those are having, maybe even do some experiments to see what would happen if we remove that stuff, and then actually kind of make some more educated decisions about the future of the habitat in terms of conservation and management. And of course, this is an issue that's important not just biologically, but also culturally and socially, and many times economically as well, because all of these things are tied in together and help define a people and who they are, and also make sure that those communities have enough money to subsist. Now, anthropogenic activities are often seen as unnatural and also incompatible with biodiversity conservation. And this is true no matter their type, their size, or their duration. We often kind of lump all these things in together. And we might say that something like coppicing, for example, which it has been a practice in Britain for a very long time, we might kind of lump that in with something like burning in order to create new areas, new open areas near a forest, or to kind of turn over the nutrients in an area. We might even lump that in with building a road or taking a walk, using ATVs. There are all sorts of things that have different time scales, they have different physical impacts, different spatial impacts, and yet we kind of group them all together and say human stuff is bad, wildlife stuff is good, and that's that. And one famous conservationist even claimed that conservation plans that integrate human and conservation needs actually threaten biodiversity. So this person went one step beyond saying, these are very distinct things, to saying actually when you put in the human element, it's automatically kind of degrading the function of that area or the function of this particular conservation plan. And unfortunately, that does overlook the historical importance of various anthropogenic activities, as well as the potential current and future contributions that these sorts of disturbances could make. It really gets rid of all the nuance and just paints everything with broad brushstrokes, and might overlook some really important things that we need to think about. And that's really frustrating, because we actually have quite a lot of good evidence that there are some historical practices that do make biodiversity possible, not just in California, as the example I mentioned before kind of indicates, but around the world in various habitats amongst various types of people on different continents and in different countries. So this is something that we need to think about in terms of managing and making use of biodiversity, as well as kind of maximizing biodiversity, if indeed that is something that we are all interested in doing. And the current article that I'm going to talk about does make that assumption, that biodiversity is something that we all agree is good and is worth pursuing. And maybe, on another day, we can think a little bit about whether that's actually the case. I'm reading a book right now at the moment that does ask some of these questions, and it's actually conservationists themselves that are saying, look, we know that we can't save all species. We don't have enough money, we don't have enough space, we don't have enough resources, and some species are already too far down the line, there are already too few of them, and they are functionally extinct. So we have to kind of make, at some point, some hard decisions about what species we want around and how many species are we actually going to actively go after saving, and then make some plans based on that. So you could actually have an argument that maybe biodiversity isn't that important, we just want a certain number of species that kind of help us do our thing, cows, dogs, cats, kind of familiar stuff, maybe the things that are really good for ecosystem function, and maybe we want to let the rest slide. And maybe that is the case. I don't personally feel that way, but some people might. But for now, we'll just assume we want as much biodiversity as we can have, because that kind of helps with habitat stability and function of the ecosystem. And you never know when something out there is going to be a reservoir of a chemical or some other property that you really need for a medicine or a food or some other thing. And so it's good to have this stuff around just in case. So let's just go with that idea today and think about some of the non-kind of ecotourism sorts of things that you can have out in the world, where you allow communities to be embedded in nature and kind of interacting with nature in a way that is sustainable for them. And at the moment, we do tend to focus on ecotourism and other kind of uninvasive model livelihoods when we try to help communities take their future into their own hands and find a way to transition from agriculture, for example. It often is kind of low levels of agriculture or having farms and domestic animals. So we try to help them transition into something new that doesn't involve cutting down trees or taking lots of flocks and herds out to eat down the wildlife. But that's not always the only thing to move those guys into ecotourism. Why not let them do what they're doing, but maybe utilize former practices, historical practices, or practices that someone did in another country that we know aren't very invasive, but allow the domestic livestock, the crops to do well, while also facilitating the natural habitat as well. So there might be kind of something in the middle that we can look for that we don't currently tend to think a whole lot about when we're trying to integrate both economic and ecological needs. And we do know that in places where communities are able to work together and manage natural resources, often livelihoods and biodiversity can go hand in hand. We see a lot of this, for example, in Kenya, when we take the biosciences students there every year as part of the master's field course. And I've had a chance to go see some of these places where you have lots of little groups of Maasai who've banded together to figure out a way to utilize the land together in a way that doesn't have to do with taking herds of goats and cows out and eating all of the leaves on every single plant that's out there. They find other uses, and they actually can be quite sustainable. And so those are sorts of options that we want to think about. Now, the authors of this research feel that conservation efforts need to, and I'm going to quote here, understand and build upon the site-specific role and importance of historical disturbance regimes, both natural and anthropogenic, in shaping and maintaining biodiversity. So at the moment, they aren't stressing that we need to do a certain thing or another. They're just saying, look, before we make any decisions, we need to know what's happening now, we need to know what happened in the past, and we need to think about how those things are affecting, not infecting, hopefully, how those things are affecting the habitat, so that we can kind of get a sense of what might happen if suddenly we remove them or increase them or decrease them or just make some sort of change. We need to know what the wide-scale repercussions are going to be. And in fact, they're particularly interested in looking at historical livelihoods, so the things that people have done for hundreds of years, kind of one after another. So it's not like they did this 100 years ago and then stopped, but in fact something that they've continued for quite a long time, because those are the situations in which you've got adaptation and evolution potentially occurring within the local wildlife community. And these are things that may have existed for thousands of years, and so could have significant impacts on specific species, but also on communities and the landscape in general. And they're interested in this topic for many reasons. First of all, they're hoping that this could help us move past kind of culture versus nature debates when we're thinking about conservation and management issues. They also think that there are many places of conservation importance where the composition, the abundance, the distribution of wildlife species have been impacted by human disturbances in the past, and so it's possible that suddenly removing humans could actually be more damaging than continuing some amount of anthropogenic activity. So just to go back to that California example, we know that as soon as the Native Americans were told that they could no longer start wildfires, they could no longer harvest certain things, that suddenly the whole shape of the landscape changed, and we no longer see as many wildflowers, for example. For example, we see that there's a lot more scrub coming up in the habitat, and there's not kind of either the open spaces or the old story canopy. You've kind of got something in the middle and it's stuck there. It's not really having the same kind of succession that it used to have. So we do know that in certain places this has had a really significant impact on the shape of the whole area, and maybe that's not actually the impact that actually we were going for. And finally, they also say that if we think about landscapes as socio-ecological systems rather than just ecological systems, we could begin to develop what they call new conservation efforts, so kind of a whole new realm of conservation efforts over larger temporal and spatial scales. So not just things that we try to kind of do quickly right now to make a change, but to make long-term plans that would allow us to kind of do things over not just our generation, but maybe the next generation as well. And these could be more effective than the things that we are currently pursuing. So basically they want the past and a full understanding of the practices and outcomes of the past to have more of an influence on the future. Now this current paper is something that provides kind of an overview, but also specifically thinks about one particular type of human-nature interaction in one particular place. And the practice is swidden, which is shifting cultivation. So basically you've got crops, and then you let it go fallow, and then you have crops again at some point in the future. And they have looked at this in Bhutan. Now, even though this is a very specific example, it hopefully can be used to draw inferences about other systems as well. So I've already mentioned the example of what we know about Native American practices in California and elsewhere in the U.S., but also there are certain parallels, for example, in Africa where you had certain nomadic activities, also in the Middle East. We know that these are things that have been seen also in Australia with the Aboriginal tribes, and not just in Bhutan, but across Southeast Asia and Asia in general. So these sorts of examples could help us to identify policies and practices that could support sustainable livelihoods and culture and also biodiversity, not just in Bhutan, but in fact around the globe. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Johnny Lang with There's Gotta Be a Change. Now on today's show I'm talking about a recent review paper that thinks about human disturbances and how certain regimes of human disturbance might actually be kind of beneficial to environments, and so removing them suddenly as we reform and try to manage land in order to pursue conservation efforts, that actually could have adverse effects that we might not expect, simply because that's been the way of doing things for so long that suddenly certain species are excluded, the structure of the habitat changes, and everything suddenly functions differently than it used to, simply because humans have been a part of that landscape for so very long, and so things have become interconnected. Now, before the break I was giving the context of all of this research and thinking about why this is an important topic to consider, and now I actually want to think about ecological disturbance in a bit more detail so we can understand how human disturbance relates to ecological disturbance. Where are they different, where are they similar, and how do these things function to influence the environment? Now, a scientific definition of ecological disturbance is that it's a relatively discrete event, so it only happens over a certain amount of time that we can measure, and then it stops. And it might happen again, but we certainly know that each one of those events is something that has a start and a finish, and that's quite an obvious thing. And it alters ecosystems, communities, or population structures, resulting in changes in resources, so things like food, water, shelter, that sort of thing. Substrates, so it might alter the soil or the water, depending on what type of habitat we're talking about. And also the physical environment. And it might not do all of these things, but it will affect one or more of these things. These events may not only shape an environment, but also maintain and kind of facilitate species composition, community structure, and ecosystem function. In order to understand how disturbances can have these sorts of impacts, can impact biodiversity, for example, we need to do a number of things. First of all, we have to identify and characterize certain attributes of disturbance and the effects of these attributes. We need to understand how disturbances interact with each other, both spatially and temporally. We need to know the boundaries of the disturbance, which is site-specific, and we need to document whether and how historical human activities may have influenced disturbance regimes. Now, I will provide some more specific details in a minute, but just in case you already feel like that's a bit much to throw at you all at once, I will give you a few examples of some disturbances and think about how you could measure some of those things. Now, we are in a coastal environment, so we know that there are certain things like severe storms that would obviously be a disturbance. So let's think about a really severe storm. So something like a hurricane or a tsunami, for example. Now, those sorts of things may not happen all that often. You might only experience a hurricane once every 10 or 20 years. In some places it might be once every 100, 200, even 1,000 years. So already you can see that you could measure how frequent that is, and that frequency might change from one type of environment to another. And as a result, you would have different degrees to which those different spaces would be influenced over the long term by a hurricane. If you had a place that is going to experience a hurricane pretty much every year, then you would probably expect that the organisms there are going to be more adapted to that sort of thing, and actually may utilize the disturbance of the hurricane to their advantage. Whereas animals and plants and other wildlife that are in a place that might only experience a hurricane once every 1,000 years, they would be taken much more by surprise. They might be a bit more adversely affected. And we know, for example, that mangroves, they depend on the ocean currents to spread their seeds around. So they drop their seeds right into the water. The currents will take the seeds somewhere new to a new shore, and then they will eventually germinate there and create a new tree. So actually, for plants like that, hurricanes might not be so bad, because the hurricanes bring in lots of wind, lots of wave action, and that can disperse the seeds really far and actually be quite beneficial, because then you have a chance to colonize new environments, you have a chance to spread your genes to areas that might have quite a lot of the same genes, and so you can have a bit more mixing of DNA, and that actually can be beneficial. But if you've got a place like maybe Falmouth, for example, where you wouldn't really expect a hurricane all that often, the plants that are living right on our shores probably don't have those sorts of adaptations. And in fact, being exposed to a hurricane would be quite detrimental, because it might just kill the trees right off the bat. It might waterlog the seeds, and so they can't germinate, they can't ever function to spread the DNA and create a new plant, and so actually that would be very negative. So you can already see where you've got these kind of variations in things. Now, when I talk about thinking about identifying and characterizing attributes, that's just really identifying what is it about the disturbance that is important, and what are the sorts of effects that it has. Do we care about how long it is? So for the hurricane, for example, is it how many days it lasts? Is it how much rain it dumps on a place? Is it how fast the winds are? Is it all of those things? So you just need to know which characteristics are actually affecting the local environment. It might not matter so much how high off the ground it goes. So for example, do the clouds go up to 200 meters above the sea level, or is it just 100 meters? That might not matter at all. I'm just picking that at random. I have no idea. But you can see where you would want to distinguish that from something like rainfall, which probably does have quite a significant impact. Then thinking about how disturbances interact spatially and temporally, you have to say, is it going to be important to know whether a hurricane is going to cover a certain amount of space by itself, or if you're going to have several hurricanes in a season, what cumulative area of land are they going to affect? So if you've got 4 that each fall in different spaces, but cumulatively they kind of cover 4 times as much land as just one alone, obviously that might be quite important to know that as you've got this periodicity from one hurricane to the next, that over time, spatially, all of that might add up. And the same thing could be true temporally as well. As I said earlier, if you've got something just happening once in 100 years versus once in 1,000 years versus every single year, that's obviously going to be quite a different scenario. And finally, knowing the boundaries of the disturbance. And when I said that the disturbance would be site-specific, what I mean is that we're not talking about things like climate change, which can affect the whole globe, but instead focusing on something that is happening in a, kind of a specific space. So one particular hurricane versus just all of the rain and wind that's happening around the world at a given time. Now, within the context of thinking about a disturbance like that, it actually could be quite difficult to then layer on top of it whether and how human activities may have influenced any of these disturbance regimes. Of course, thinking about hurricanes, that's quite a large thing, and weather type related events are a little bit more difficult, because it might be difficult to envision how human behavior could in any way kind of relate to a hurricane, which is massive. It happens from outside. We can't affect it in any way. But when you're thinking about something in a forest, for example, when you might be able to compare logging activity versus if a tree gets sick and dies from a disease naturally, there you can see a bit more of a parallel, and you can see how you might be able to compare those two more specifically and be able to see how these things might work together or work against each other and so on. So it's kind of thinking about all these different things in lots of different environments with lots of different types of disturbances in order to figure out where are humans doing something that's different from that sort of thing, where are they enhancing it, where are they interacting with it, and do we kind of care about those relationships? Do they have enough of an influence that we need to think about that going forward as we make management plans? Now, as I already said, disturbances can be characterized according to things like type, so is it a hurricane, is it a fire, etc., spatial features, temporal characteristics, specificity, intensity, resulting relationships, and so on. Now in forests, there are three particularly important characteristics of disturbance, and I mention these because the area that the researchers focus on in Bhutan is forested. And these are return interval, severity, and landscape level spatial patterns that result from the disturbance event. Now there's something that was proposed in 1978 called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And it has been contested, but it's kind of an interesting idea. And this is the theory that biological diversity is greatest in environments that are subject to intermediate levels of disturbance. So in places where you've got very little disturbance and lots of disturbance, you have lower levels of biodiversity. But in the middle, that kind of facilitates space that the really sensitive animals can live in, but also the very generalist animals, the ones that aren't sensitive, they can also kind of coexist. And so you've got all of them being able to utilize the space together. Now, the reason this is kind of contested is that we see that on different spatial scales this does and does not have support. And so it's kind of an issue of what are the spatial scales that we're interested in thinking about, and what are the ones that are actually useful for us to concentrate on. And in forests, we know that frequent or intense disturbances do exclude species that require structurally diverse and closed canopy conditions. In the absence of disturbance, you instead will have shade-tolerant plants that are characteristic of mature forests, and these will exclude species that require more sun. So you can see where kind of on either end, you're kind of facilitating things for just one small group of organisms. But if you have kind of a mixture and you're right there in the middle, you could have both the shade-loving and the sun-loving animals all kind of coexisting in their own little portion of the habitat. Disturbances increase functional heterogeneity, in other words, the different kinds of processes that can happen within a habitat. And this in turn can increase the opportunities for coexistence and therefore increase biodiversity. So the debate about the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, as I said, has a lot to do with differences in scale, the spatial scale and also the temporal scale. And it's most persuasive over really large spatial scales, over long time periods, and where there are multiple disturbances that are occurring. So places just like the forests where people are conducting swidden. And in these sorts of places, disturbance can actually increase the functional heterogeneity, opportunities for coexistence among species assemblages or groups of animals living in the same place, animals and other wildlife, I should say, and also overall biodiversity. So in other words, actually this kind of intermediate amount of disturbance where you've got both natural and probably also human activities, could actually be a really good thing and help maintain a lot of different species of wildlife. And although we often think of nature as static and habitats as being fairly unchanging, actually we know that ecosystems are in a state of non-equilibrium. And what this reflects, this term non-equilibrium, is the fact that they could actually change at any time as a result of unpredictable and stochastic events. So things like hurricanes, lightning strikes, diseases that would hit a bunch of plants, and so maybe they would all, so for trees, for example, that would hit the trees and they would all topple over and open up a big hole in the canopy. There could be an earthquake, there could be a mudslide. You never know when that's actually going to happen. And so this is what makes it hard for us to say that any ecosystem is kind of stable, because that could happen tomorrow, it could happen the next day, and you never really know. And after it does happen, organisms are generally able to bounce back. It may take a really long time, but they can bounce back. For example, we know that meteors have struck Earth in the past and have had significant impacts. We know that the dinosaurs went extinct kind of more or less all at once because of significant activity from spatial material, and yet over a long enough period of time, the dinosaurs of course didn't come back to life, but other species came in, the ecosystems rebuilt themselves, other organisms filled the role that the dinosaurs were playing previously, and things kind of came back to life. Now, this may not be the end point, things can go on and change again, but the point is that the ecosystem is quite fluid, and it is always changing. This is one of the reasons it's quite hard for us to say, we want this to change, we're going to dial back the clock to the way it used to be. And then you say, well, how far are we dialing back this clock? There is no start or stop. It's just always kind of a continual change. And it's hard to guess what ecosystems will look like after disturbance occurs, because post-disturbance pathways are often diverse and very unpredictable. And so when you take all of this into consideration, it's clear that disturbances create a range of environmental conditions and ecological stages, and that these increase the habitat and potentially also the species diversity across the whole landscape at large. Now, we often think of wilderness as being natural. However, humans have hunted, gathered, pruned, planted, burned, whatever, over lots of different landscapes for thousands of years. In the New World, it's something like 10 to 12,000 years. In Australia, it's about 50,000 years. And in Africa, it's at least 50,000, probably several tens of thousands more years than that. So all of these places that we currently live are places that have been affected by humans for actually quite a long time. And not just because we've been hunting and gathering there, but because we've been doing that over a fairly large scale in a fairly consistent way. And so we've begun to have probably an evolutionary impact on the organisms that live there. So many of these environments have not only been influenced by, but also actually evolved in conjunction with human activity. And it's still true that human disturbances can have negative effects. So I'm not saying that all this stuff is, good and happy and we should pursue it. But I'm also just saying that we have shown a number of instances in which there are neutral or even positive effects of these human behaviors, and we can't just ignore those and pretend that it's only the bad stuff that's going on, especially given that these have a very long history. So for example, Aboriginal women in Australia increased and maintained habitat diversity and also small mammal populations that were used for foods for thousands of years before the Europeans kind of came in and often put quite a damper on what they were doing in the habitat. We also know in Indonesia that the Kodi people used fire for about 14,000 years to shape the structure and the function of their environment. And in both of these cases, the practices weren't haphazard, they weren't random, but in fact people were controlled kind of by their local culture, really, because there were rules, there were customs, there were institutions, there were set ways of doing things that people did over and over and over. And that's one of the reasons why the wildlife could adapt, because there was a certain pattern there, and so the plants and the animals could all kind of not learn in the sense of kind of thinking about it and changing on purpose, but they could adjust because things were expected. So when we make decisions about land management in conjunction with conservation or not, we need to keep these sorts of historic disturbance regimes in mind and ponder what's going to be happening if they are altered, because it's highly likely that removing them could affect both ecological conditions and also biodiversity. So that's a lot of general talk. Let's think a little bit more specifically about the questions that the researchers are asking about Swidden and Bhutan in this particular paper. First of all, they wanted to know what role could this land use have played in fostering and maintaining biological diversity in Bhutan. And secondly, they're interested in exploring what sorts of insights and principles can an understanding of this system provide to sustainable conservation practices in the future. So the first question really is, what is Swidden? So there are two different types of Swidden as practiced in Bhutan. And the first is seri, which is a bush fallow system in which trees and shrubs comprise the fallow. And this is used generally in conjunction with the production of maize, millet, rice, and also vegetables, and tends to happen at lower altitudes. The other type is pangxing, and this is a grass fallow system, and it's used for producing wheat, buckwheat, barley, and also greens, and it tends to be at the higher altitudes. And in this case, in the first case, you've got cultivation occurring over 1 to 2 years, and then the land would go fallow for 2 to 8 or even more years. In pangxing, you've got cultivation for a bit longer, so 2 to 3 years, and then also fallow for longer, so it would be fallow for 6 to 20 years. So using fire, farmers would create gaps in the forest canopy in order to produce crops in the spaces that were opened up below that were then getting more light. And the gaps were much larger than the ones that would have been created naturally when wind and insects and disease-associated tree mortality would have caused trees to fall over and kind of open up plots of land where they could have just opportunistically gone in and grown certain things. Now, not all forested areas in Bhutan were devoted to Swidden. Some of the areas were off limits because of accessibility. They might have been on a really extreme slope, or religious reasons, so they may have had certain kind of sacred sites. But there were quite a few areas that were covered with this particular type of land use. And the intensity of Swidden-related disturbance is a function of several factors, including temperature, temperature of the fires that were used to create the openings, the duration, so how long was there a crop, how long was it fallow, and also the frequency of fires and cultivation introduced to the sites. Now in seri, soil disturbance is minimal, or was minimal, because the ground was rarely plowed and weeding and harvesting are performed by hand. So you're not doing anything that's really intensively kind of going in and churning up the top layer of soil. On the other hand, in pangxing, the topsoil was cut to a depth of 5 to 7 centimeters, then it was left to dry for several months, piled into mounds, and then burned at temperatures up to 500 degrees Celsius. And as you can imagine, this had quite a bit more of a significant effect, so it could eliminate the perennial vegetation and also most of the fauna, and it would increase, potentially, the risk of runoff and also erosion. So this is something that would have an impact not just locally on the wildlife there, but in fact over quite a large area of land if there was runoff and erosion happening. Now the reason all this is interesting in Bhutan is that Swidden was extremely widespread until the 1990s, but is not anymore. And we don't know much about the historical practices in Bhutan because we just don't have really good records, not written records at least. However, we do know that Swidden is important throughout that region of the world. Some 10 million hectares are devoted to forest farming, according to some estimates, and also supposedly there are 50 to 200 million Swidden farmers in the eastern Himalayas alone. So we do know that kind of in that general part of the world, this is something that takes place or has taken place over quite a large portion of the land and has involved lots and lots of people. And in fact, in some places, still involves lots of people. And this is one of the reasons it's interesting, is that there are other areas where this is still going on. And so if we can learn some stuff from Bhutan, we can maybe apply it to those places. Swidden was curtailed in Bhutan from 1969 onwards with the introduction of the Bhutan Forestry Act. And that's because people felt that Swidden was kind of backwards, they thought it was destructive. They saw it as humans going in and manipulating the habitat too much, and so they wanted it to stop. And it completely ceased from 1997, from which point the former Swiddens transitioned into forest because they were no longer being disturbed, so whatever was going to kind of happen naturally with the canopy was allowed to happen. And in these places, human activity and disturbance has either declined and is much less than it used to be, or it has completely ceased. And on top of this, adding to kind of the intrigue of the whole situation, Bhutan is located in the eastern Himalaya region, which is a global biodiversity hotspot. So Bhutan in particular is quite biodiverse because it's located in a convergence zone of several different biogeographical realms. So you've got kind of tropical things, you've got more temperate things, you've got very cold areas. So it's just a mixture of kind of climates, basically, which allows for lots of different wildlife. It also has an extreme altitudinal gradient, as you probably guessed when I talked about the two different types of swidden happening at different altitudes. It has pronounced climate variability, and it's been subject to extreme natural and anthropogenic disturbances that have interacted in lots of ways, very complex ways, also hierarchical ways, kind of joining in together over large spatial scales for a really long time. Now, the government in Bhutan has established protected areas and also biological corridors that cover over half the country, and they have pledged that they are interested in preserving their wildlife and preserving their habitat, which is kind of one of the things that makes this a bit tricky, is that they have outlawed certain practices because they wanted to help biodiversity, but it turns out now they're reconsidering this a bit because they realize that maybe the practices they've outlawed actually helped improve biodiversity, and so they have in fact indicated a willingness to maybe rethink things, and so the authors have been there to help try to initiate some of this research. And one of the kind of, I want to say interesting, but I say that a lot. One of the things that also contributes to making this a situation that's a bit delicate is that human communities have been allowed to remain within the parks, but they're no longer allowed to pursue historical livelihoods, and land use is extremely restricted. So they're allowed to be there and potentially even to pursue ecotourism activities, for example, but they're not allowed to do swidden at the moment. So it might be that some of these guys that are there and not really doing what they grew up doing, not doing what they want to do, they might potentially be allowed to return to these practices if it can be shown that actually those things are beneficial. The effect of swidden was an increase in the number and size of open areas, or canopy gaps, to use the scientific term, in comparison to areas that had natural tree falls. And we know this from talking to people, and we also know it from looking at other countries where swidden occurred. And there was also this maintenance of complex mosaics of early successional species at various stages of development. So you would have people opening up a canopy gap over here, letting another one go fallow over there, and you would do this kind of on one year, and then you would start a new thing over here on another year. And so you've got multiple plots that have been started and are being managed at different time points, and that means that you've got things that are 1 year old, 2 year old, 5 years old, 10 years old, and that means that you've got plants of different sizes, different types of plants, and therefore different types of animals that are coming in, different types of fungi that are colonizing them. It just allows you to have lots of diversity in the habitat and lots of wildlife coming in to utilize those spaces. Flora in the swidden fallows differed from those in adjacent forest plots, and we know that where undisturbed forests are retained, swiddens can actually increase the floristic diversity at large spatial scales. So maybe locally that's not the case because you've only got a couple of different types of plots, but over the entire forest where you've got lots of different people doing those different fallow and cultivating activities at different times, that's where you see the benefit, and that's where you see all the different diversity. One reason for this maintenance is the incredibly diverse variety of tree species that you have. So you've got little saplings to the kind of mid-story all the way up to the old canopy growth, and those may be completely different species and completely different assemblages of species. It all has to do with how much sunlight and how much shade that they need, and as those conditions change, you facilitate the growth of different types of tree species. Now, there's little work on the influence of swidden on fauna, unfortunately, but we do know that in general, disturbed secondary forests tend to have more sandbar deer, more wild pigs, and also more gore. And this is relative to sections of forests that are quite dense and undisturbed. And these are all species that are important sources of food for tigers, which means that swidden practices could have potentially facilitated the maintenance of large and healthy tiger populations. And we all know, I've talked about tigers in the past, they are an endangered species. We are quite worried about them. And so to think that Swidden practices could be one means by which large predators like this could coexist with humans, even in densely populated and pretty disturbed habitats, is actually really encouraging. And it suggests that if we look for these sorts of creative solutions, we might be able to allow humans and predators and other types of species to coexist much more peacefully and much more closely than we might have previously guessed. So the discontinuation of Swidden practices has resulted in increased forest cover and also density of forest in lots of different areas, but also in more intense disturbance in others. So there aren't just the places where human activity has completely ceased and things have been allowed to fill in and grow back up, but also there are other areas where the government has gone in and allowed people to go harvest trees for timber. And of course, harvesting trees for timber is going to be way more intense than just taking out a few trees here and there in order to make a small field, because there are entire sections of forest that are being just completely removed when we're talking about timber. Now, unfortunately, it's hard for us to know anything really specific about the impact of this change because we have so few data about previous practices. And so the researchers really emphasize how important it is to visit the area now and collect as much information as possible from the people who remember engaging in Swidden, and go to neighboring areas where that's still being done and use some data from there as well. And this really highlights that we need to research the historical techniques before we discontinue them in order to be able to do a more scientific kind of before and after survey and make sure that we aren't getting rid of something that actually we probably want to keep. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, we could also be performing experiments on portions of protected land in order to see whether the introduction of, or the reintroduction, I should say, of disturbances could actually be useful. So if the government of Bhutan were to set aside a particular forest patch, for example, and do Swidden in little bits of it, and see if that actually helps improve diversity over the forest patch, then maybe that would be a really good example, and then they could apply that technique over a broader scale throughout the rest of the country. And even if we don't want to continue these practices, we decide ultimately we don't want Swidden, we don't want this other type of disturbance, it's still good to collect information on the ecological impacts of these activities, because this would allow us to anticipate the effects of their discontinuation and kind of provide for that in our management plans. And this is really important in highly productive ecosystems such as rainforests, where we think that disturbance probably prevents competitive exclusion by dominant species and so facilitates lots of different animals and plants living together. And if we remove disturbance in these areas, we might suddenly see a shift in which species and how many are able to utilize those environments. Now, one of the things that makes this type of research quite challenging is that, as you might suspect, there are lots of political sensitivities because the people who engage in traditional practices are often marginalized, poor, indigenous, minorities in some way or another, and that makes it quite hard for them to have a voice. And it also means that politicians and decision makers tend to often look down on them. And we also tend to think of protected or protection-worthy places as kind of pristine and needing separation from humans. And it's really not easy to override pre-existing notions about what's natural, what's wild, and how humans and nature should interact. And on top of all of that, we know that things like logging, cash crops, finding oil, all that kind of stuff that's economic can be a real wrench in the works. I mean, it can really influence how people think, and actually it can cause people to stop thinking because they just focus on the financial aspects of things. Now, I don't want to end on a negative note because, as I kind of hinted at in talking about Bhutan, actually lots of Asian governments have recently indicated growing support for what they term adaptive forest management, and in particular management that's based on scientific and ecological principles. And this may, in fact, open the door to more creative solutions to conservation problems, potentially the reintroduction of Swidden or other types of traditional practices. And if attempts are made to put this kind of idea into practice and the outcome is positive, then it may be that that sort of land management scheme could become more common and also more popular, not just in Asia, but elsewhere as well. And so this might mean that historical knowledge could be the missing key, in a sense, to bridging the gap between the desire to conserve biodiversity and also the need to provide human resources and make space for people on the planet as well. So this is quite an interesting topic to think about and to kind of keep your eye on, because as it develops, it might mean some really intriguing changes to policy and to practices. And actually this is quite pertinent because I'm reading a whole book that touches on many of these topics as well, in the context of thinking about how many people can the Earth actually hold, and how can we have wildlife and people all getting what we need out of the finite space that we've got around. So I will keep paying attention to this and report back to you as I find out new things. And I believe that is all for me this week. I hope you enjoyed that and found it enlightening, and I will talk to you next week.